So let's move on to the poetry section of the exam. Another quick reminder of page numbers. So like I said earlier on with Macbeth, make sure you turn to the correct page. Poetry, there'll only be one section because all students across all schools will study the same poems. So there's not different anthologies like different examples. Actually, everyone does the same. You'll be answering 2 questions in this section. You'll be answering a 15 marker on a named poem, and you'll be answering, then comparing that with a poem of your choice, which I'll go over in a bit more detail in a moment. So you will see on the screen now, these are some of the previous questions that have come up, or previous poetry and poems that have come up in the exam. You can have a quick look at those now. Now, it's quite difficult for us to predict. However, there are a couple of patterns. Remember, these are simply predictions. There is no guarantee. You need to know all of these poems. The 2 that haven't really come up much, if you notice here, you can see that a lot of these are war, loss. You've got some relationship poems that have come up last year as well, war and relationships last year. So because of this, we can see that power and nature have not come up. Power you did in the mocks. So Hawk Roosting did in the mocks as a named poem. Hawk Roosting hasn't been up as well, so I would suggest spending a bit more time on Hawk Roosting. I'm not going to focus on Hawk Roosting today because I think that's actually one of the easier poems that students should be able to look at independently. And because you did it in the mocks as well, you should be more confident with Hawk Roosting. Most students compared Hawk Roosting to Ozymandias. Again, I would suggest, if you can, to do the same. So I would suggest that it's worthwhile spending some time this weekend dedicated to Hawk Roosting and Ozymandias, just in case Hawk Roosting is the named poem, because like I said, it hasn't come up before, and Ozymandias hasn't come up for a number of years. It was last in 2017 as a specimen paper, not actually as a named poem. So Hawk Roosting and Ozymandias, it's worthwhile spending some time on those 2 areas. And the other one that hasn't come up is nature. So nature has not come up as a named poem for a number of years as well. Last in afternoons over there, but that's it. And then in a specimen paper to autumn. So today's I'm going to focus on a nature poem, and actually one of the more challenging nature poems that I don't think would be the named poem. I'd be very surprised if it was a named poem because it's such a tough poem, but it would be one that you could potentially compare with the named poem. So I'll go into that in a bit more detail in a moment. And on the screen now, you can just see, because I'm focusing on nature today, these are the nature poems. So you have To Autumn, Afternoons, Death of a Naturalist, A Prelude, and Imperceptibly as Grief. The To Autumn, no, Afternoons, sorry. Afternoons came up a few years ago. When did it come up? Afternoon came up in 2021. Could use it again, but so that has already come up. These, To Autumn, The Prelude, and Imperceptibly as Grief, these are romantic poets. Now, these are probably the most challenging poems that you have in the anthology. It is suggested that students could compare the named poem with one of these poems, but I think it would be unlikely that that would be the named poem for the 15 marker, because the romantic poets are very challenging, and you can see there the Inspired by Romantics from Dickinson's Imperceptibly as Grief. So it's unlikely, not impossible, but unlikely it would be To Autumn, The Prelude, or An Imperceptibly as Grief. Afternoons came up a couple of years ago. Death of a Naturalist, most of your English teachers potentially would have focused on that this week, because if we had to pick one poem, we would hope it would be this one, and potentially it will because it hasn't come up yet. Another reminder, you do get a contents page with the poems and the poets as well, so you're not expected to memorise 18 poem titles and 18 poets. You will get a copy of this in the exam as well. Here's an example of how it will look. So you can see you've got the named poem, the 15 marker here. So you've got the poem there, and this is 2023. You get a copy of that poem, and that's worth 15 marks. And then you have the 25 marker at the bottom here, and that's the one where you have to compare the named poem, which is here. You have to compare the named poem from the 15 marker, and you have to compare it with a poem of your choice, one poem of your choice. I've seen students before where they compare one poem with like 3 poems. Do not do that. You are comparing one poem with the named poem. That is it. If you start comparing 3 or 4, you're not going to get marks for it, or if you do, there'll be incredibly low marks. So compare one poem with one poem. That is it. This 25 marker is one of the worst performing questions on the whole of the literature GCSE. Number of reasons why. It's because it's the last question, so students run out of time. They spend far too long on Macbeth, which means that if they work in chronological order, they run out of time by the time they get to the 25 marker. So that means that sometimes the 25 marker is negatively impacted by that. Also, it is a really tough question. It's tough because there are 18 poems. You haven't got a copy of the poem. You're expected to memorise quotations. If you don't memorise quotations, you at least need to remember what happens in the poems. And you're also expected to write about context. So you're expected to write about what may have inspired the poets too. So this is a really tough question, but don't forget this is an untiered paper. So you've got the range of different grade students that will be sitting this paper. So that's the reason why it is tough. That is reflected in the grade boundaries being quite low. The grade boundary is about 40%. So don't panic, don't give up, don't not attempt it. The worst thing you could do is not attempt the question. You'll be surprised. They tend to be a bit more lenient with the poetry because they know it is so difficult. So don't avoid it completely. That would be the worst thing you can do. Attempt, attempt, attempt. So in the hope that one of the nature poems is the named poem on Monday, I've looked at the prelude. Now, again, I don't think that this would be the named poem. I've said already, this is a really difficult poem because it's a romantic poet. And because of that, I think it's unlikely that that would be the named poem. But you never know. If we know this poem well enough, it might be one that you could compare with, like Death of a Naturalist and so forth. Okay. So here's the question. It says, read the poem, The Prelude by William Wordsworth. The Prelude is a poem about nature. How does William Wordsworth present nature in the poem? And then you need to refer to context as well. So I'm just going to start making some notes on potentially what I would focus on. Obviously, this is not the only thing that you could focus on. There will be other things that you could potentially focus on too. Okay. So I'm going to start. Hang on, I'm just making a bit of room. Picking up on a couple of quotations to begin with. So let's look. The frosty season when the sun was set and visible for many a mile, the cottage windows through the twilight blaze, I heeded not the summons. So let's just look at how nature's being presented at the beginning. You've got the frosty season, the sun was set. You've got through the windows, the twilight blazing. So already at the beginning of the poem, you've got these really positive connotations being created. So you have the sun. Oh, hang on. 1 second. You've got the sun. I'm going to do this quickly. You've got the sun. You've got the twilight blazed. Hang on, don't want that. Twilight blazed through the cottage windows. So we're associating it with warmth and comfort. Warmth and comfort. It comes across as quite peaceful and quite tranquil. It's welcoming. Nature is welcoming at the beginning of this poem. If we were to continue, he speaks about it being a happy time. It was a time of rapture. I'll speak about that part in a moment. I'll do it now actually. So he describes it as a happy time, a time of rapture. Rapture is like extreme ecstasy. It's extreme happiness. So we have rapture. We've got that extreme ecstasy or extreme happiness. It's very joyous at this moment. So again, you've got nature is really trying, is personified in some ways as well as being incredibly positive at the beginning of the poem. Okay. He then goes on to describe the ice skating. So he's ice skating with his friends. I'm not going to focus on that at the moment because the poem is about nature. If it were about childhood memories, which is another one it could focus on as well. If it were about memories, then I would speak about this because he is describing his memory as a child playing games whilst ice skating with his friends. He was called by his parents to go home. He doesn't. Instead, he carries on playing the game. And through the darkness and the cold we flew, not a voice was idle with the din. Meanwhile, the precipices rang aloud. So now we're starting to see, actually, there's a bit of a change in view of nature here. So they rang aloud the leafless trees. You've got the icy crag. It tinkled like iron. Distant hills into the tumult sent an alien sound of melancholy. So we can see a real shift here. So we call that a volta in poetry. So we've got a volta, shift in tone. So nature becomes more threatening. And how can we put it? Unknown. Right. Key question is why? What is it that's caused this to happen? So you have at the beginning where nature seems quite beautiful and tranquil. And then he has this lovely memory where he's describing ice skating with his friends. And where he's having lots of fun, he's hissed along the polished ice, so you've got that sibilance there to show his enjoyment. He's kind of skating really quickly. And then it changes. So what we are then also looking at in this poem is not just how nature, we're also looking at how Wordsworth's view of nature changes and what causes his view of nature to change. And this is linked to loss of innocence. So I'm going to put here, and this is what makes this poem really difficult. It's not just on the surface level about it being a memory of ice skating. Actually, it's what causes his views of nature to change. So Wordsworth's views of nature change due to loss of innocence. Due to loss of innocence. I'm going to briefly speak about loss of innocence because some students get quite confused by it. Loss of innocence usually comes with age and experience, okay? So innocence is usually, I'm going to write this here, lost due to age and experience. Now, as we get older, when we're younger, I'm going to speak about this briefly, when we're younger we can come across as quite fearless because we're not fully aware of the dangers in the world. We don't know the real world. We don't know actually some of the threats that are posed to us. And as we get older, as our brains, our knowledge increases, as we start to have a better understanding of the world, and with that can come fear. So that it's not just that we get older, is actually sometimes as adults we can become more fearful because we know how dangerous the world can be. And now specifically with Wordsworth, with his own life, his relationship with nature changes because he starts to fear nature, and I'm going to talk about that now. And I'm going to say Wordsworth grew up in the Lake District, and he sees nature as both beautiful. He sees it as healing. He speaks about that in other poems in his prelude, but also terrifying. And it is terrifying because of it's unknown. He often speaks about mountains. Oh, terrifying. What am I doing here? Terrifying. He often speaks about nature, about mountains, about these kind of vast landscapes, and how these vast landscapes can be terrifying because they're unknown. And we call this the sublime. So the sublime is nature is beautiful, but also terrifying. Okay, and that is reflected in this poem. The sublime is reflected in this poem where he sees the beauty in nature, but he also sees the terror in nature at the end. Okay, he describes it as an alien sound. The use of this metaphor is suggesting that this is unknown, it's foreign to him, and because it's unknown, that can make it terrifying. He says there was a tumult and sent an alien sound. So this tumult means it's quite chaotic now, this sound, this distant hills, you can hear these noises. He says it tinkled like iron. Iron, obviously a really strong metal. If you were to hit iron, it makes quite an uncomfortable sound. So again, that simile is showing that he is uncomfortable with nature by the end of this poem. He says, describes the sound as an alien sound of melancholy. Melancholy means deep sadness. So again, he has this change in relationship with nature where he starts to fear it. One of the possible reasons why he starts to have a change in relationship with nature, not only is a loss of innocence, but also linked to loss of innocence, Wordsworth's parents die, so death of his parents in his childhood. I want to say he was 8, but I can't actually remember. Death of parents in childhood. So what then happens is that the memory, this quite innocent memory that he had of enjoying ice skating with his friends, it is now tainted because he is writing this poem as an adult. So it is an innocent memory. I'm just going to write this here. Innocent memory that has been tainted now that he writes the poem as an adult. He mentioned this before in my classes, that the Prelude is a work of 50 years, nearly 8,000 lines in length. He was working on this poem through most of his life. He dies in his late 70s, 80s. But he works on this poem and adapts and creates and adds to this poem, this epic poem, for over 50 years. So obviously when he is reflecting back on memories, he will be changing parts. So it is very likely that actually some of this sadness and melancholy you have at the end of this poem, and with linked to nature, is linked to his own life and essentially what he was going through at that particular moment too. Okay. A couple other things for, he's a romantic poet, so because of that, it has a concerns nature. Many of the romantic poets were concerned about the changes to relate in nature. I'm not going to go into it now, but it's linked to Industrial Revolution and French Revolution and so forth. But there is a deep concern with nature, and that is prevalent in many of the many of the romantic poets as well. Okay, right. I'm going to stop that. Move on to the next video.